Some questions sound like an invitation to misbehave, to let loose, to stop caring, to do the thing you've been told you shouldn't. But this week's question is something quieter than that, something more honest. Welcome to One Question, a short weekly reflection to help you reconnect with your body, your values, and your truth. This week's question is, what would you do differently if no one was watching? I want to tell you something I've been sitting with for a while. For much of my career in tech, I performed toughness. Not consciously, not cynically, but I did it. I used bluster. I took up a certain kind of space. I cultivated an edge that said, I'm not someone you can push around. I belong here. I am as hard as this environment requires me to be. And some of that was useful. Some of it was even true in its own way. But a lot of it was armor. A lot of it was a performance for an audience. An invisible one, mostly, that I had decided needed to see me as bigger, harder, tougher than I actually am. Because the truth is, I'm not that tough. Not really. On the inside, I am fairly mushy. I am tender and gentle, and I feel things deeply, and I care enormously about people, about ideas, about doing things with integrity. I am not hard. I never have been. What I am is strong, and those two things, toughness and strength, are not the same. I have strong opinions. I'm courageous. I'm direct. I'm not afraid of conflict when something matters. I'm curious and I'm willing to ask hard questions, and I do not fold easily under pressure. That's real. That's who I am. But it doesn't require an edge. It shouldn't require armor. It doesn't require me to perform anything. At some point, and I couldn't tell you exactly when, I stopped caring about the audience I had been flexing for. And once I stopped caring about them, I could stop performing for them. I could be strong and tender at the same time, direct and warm, opinionated and genuinely open, courageous and soft. It turned out that those things were never opposites. I had just been told they were. The concept of performing for an invisible audience has deep roots in psychology. The sociologist Erving Goffman wrote about what he called impression management, the way we all, constantly and often unconsciously, manage how we appear to others. He describes social life as a kind of theater. We have our front stage, where we perform for our audience, and our backstage, where we are just ourselves. Most of us spend a significant portion of our lives on the front stage. That's not inherently bad. Social performance is a part of how we navigate the world, how we build trust, and how we signal that we understand the rules of the spaces we're in. But Goffman's insight was that we often lose track of which stage we're on. We start performing even when the audience has left, even when it's never really there. Psychologists call this the spotlight effect. The consistent tendency to overestimate how much other people are noticing and evaluating us. Research by Thomas Gilovic at Cornell found that we are, in almost every situation, far less observed than we believe. The audience we're performing for is much smaller, much less attentive, and much less interested in our performance than we think they are. We are, in other words, often performing to an empty room. I say this to my clients all the time. Nobody's paying that much attention. And I don't mean it to sound harsh at all. And yet, these performances can shape us. And that's what's worth us sitting with today. When we perform toughness long enough, for instance, we can start to believe that our tenderness is a liability. When we perform certainty long enough, we can start to feel ashamed of doubt. When we perform having it all together, we can lose access to the parts of ourselves that don't, the parts that are uncertain or tired or in need of something. Neuroscience has something interesting to say about all of this. Research on emotional suppression, which is the habitual dampening of genuine emotional expression, shows that over time, it takes a psychological toll. The cardiovascular system has to work harder. Cortisol levels rise. The very act of managing how we appear to others, when it becomes chronic, costs the body something very real. But the inverse is also true. Studies on authenticity, which is an experience of acting in alignment with one's genuine values and self, consistently show improvements in psychological well-being, stronger relationships, and greater resilience. Being real is not just more pleasant. It's actually healthier. It actually is better for us. The performance has a cost, and the question is whether we've noticed that we're still paying it, even when the audience stopped watching a long time ago. I want to bring this into the body because that's where it lives. Think about a moment when you were truly unobserved, not just alone in a room, but genuinely unwatched, not even by your own inner critic. Maybe it was an early morning before anyone else was awake. Maybe it was in nature or during a creative project that you get lost in, or in a conversation with someone who makes you feel completely safe. What were you in that moment? How did you move through it? What did you let yourself feel or say or do that you might have managed differently if someone had been watching? For a lot of people, the answer involves some version of softness, more slowness, more openness to uncertainty, more genuine curiosity, and less performed confidence, more tenderness towards others and towards ourselves. That person, the one in that unobserved moment, is not your lesser self. That's not you with your guard down in a way that makes you vulnerable. It's actually often your truer self, the one who exists before the performance begins. And here is the question we're sitting with. What would it mean to let that person show up more often? Not to abandon your strength or your directness or your courage, but to stop needing them as armor. To let them simply be yours, worn lightly without any performance attached. Whew. There's a world right now that is louder and more observed than perhaps any time in history. Most of us carry a device that can broadcast our lives to hundreds or thousands of people with a few taps. The pressure to curate, to present, to manage how we appear has never been greater or more constant. And yet something interesting is happening in response to that. There is a growing hunger, particularly among people who have been performing online for a long time. The hunger is for the unobserved, for the real, for the unfiltered. People are stepping back from performance, sometimes tentatively and sometimes decisively, and asking, who am I when I'm not trying to be something for someone else? That question is worth asking even if you've never posted anything on social media in your whole life, because the audience we perform for isn't always external. Sometimes the most relentless audience is inside of us. The internalized voices of how we are supposed to be, what we are supposed to be doing, what we are supposed to look like, how we are supposed to show up. That audience can be the hardest one to stop performing for. So this week's question, what would you do differently if no one was watching? Not as a permission slip to be reckless, not as an invitation to abandon the parts of you that are genuinely and authentically strong, but as a quiet inquiry into where the performance ends and you begin. What would you let yourself be? Softer, slower, a little more uncertain, more tender, more joyful, if the invisible audience wasn't there? What have you been making harder than it needs to be? What have you been armoring that doesn't need armor anymore? And is it possible that the qualities you've been performing, the toughness, the certainty, the having it all together, are actually covering something truer and more powerful underneath? Strength and tenderness are not opposites. You are allowed to be both. Thank you for joining me for one question. What would you do differently if no one was watching? Think about it. Until next week, be kind to yourself. Take the armor off just for today. And always ask better questions.